Well, hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I'm your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet, and we have the pleasure of having Dr. Malcom Kendrick on. He is all the way across the pond in England, I believe, and he will do a better job of introducing himself. I am excited to talk about his book, As the Clot Thickens. We're going to be talking about heart attacks and cardiovascular disease and what is the real cause of them. So, Dr. Kendrick, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I am in sunny, although I am initially Scottish, you'll be glad to know. I do now live in England, just south of Manchester, where I still work as a family physician. And I do other things as well. I also do a lot of research into cardiovascular disease, which I've done for the last 40 years or so. So I'm now trying to work off 20,000 million calories from various dinners and lunches over the period.
Right.
Dipping out for a walk in a hugely windy, windswept country, but not the weather you've had. Just very, very wet and windy here. Yeah.
Well, isn't that kind of usual for your area?
Yeah, well, wet and windy is pretty much what we get.
Yeah, right.
Nasty weather comes all the way over the Atlantic from you and arrives at us. And then we get a bit of American leftovers usually from here.
Well, we have. If you've been following the weather in the United States, we've had some really bad snowstorms and cold weather across the nation. Canceled flights. The air travel has been a nightmare. So I don't know if that's affected you guys over in England or not.
We had it very cold just before Christmas. In fact, my brother lives in Ottawa, or just between Ottawa and Toronto. He just missed the very worst of it. He lives in the country, so I'm aware that it's been a bit chilly.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your book, The Clot Thickens.
Well, a lot of people have asked me, why are you interested in heart disease and what happened? Well, it happened many, many years ago when I was a medical student in Scotland, where at the time Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world. Well, that's what everyone said. It may even be true. I found one thing about medical statistics is you have to look at them about 500 times to find out if they're true or not. But it was definitely very high. So really, the rate in the early 1980s was around about 6 times what it is now. It has fallen, as it's done in many countries in Western Europe. But of course, when you're training as a doctor, and that's the number one health condition that there is, and you're just seeing people coming all the time, you think, well, what is it? Now, like everybody else, I mean, I was being taught that it's cholesterol and it's diet and it's too much fat in the diet, the terrible Scots diet and all the nasty things that we eat, and that's what's causing our heart disease rate. And that was pretty much the story. And I suppose, you're being bombarded with so many facts. You don't think, well, this is clearly nonsense. It just comes in. But I also happened to travel to France quite a lot. I like France. And one thing I knew about the French was they sure don't hold back on saturated fat consumption. In fact, the data at the time when I looked at it was that the French had the highest saturated fat consumption in Europe and the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease. And in fact, it was higher than the Scots, and their cholesterol level was slightly higher than the Scots. And if you looked at all the things, they smoked more, they exercised less. I'm not quite sure whether I believe that or not. The rate of diabetes was the same. In fact, every factor between the Scots and the French was virtually identical, except that the French maybe had slightly worse risk factors. So there was more smoking and slightly more diabetes, etc., etc. And yet the rate of heart disease was one fifth of that in Scotland. So you start looking at information like that, and you think, well, it's not really adding up, is it? So I began to think, well, I still at that time believed that cholesterol caused heart disease because I hadn't really thought about it very much. And superficially, it makes sense. You get cholesterol and you get more cholesterol in your bloodstream, and it somehow or other gets into the arteries, and then it thickens them up, and then you get heart disease. Now, like a lot of things, I think it was H.L. Mencken, a very famous American who I quite like, who said, for every complicated solution, as an answer that's simple, easy to understand, and wrong. But I began looking at it, and I started to then question the whole thing. Well, if saturated fat isn't the cause of heart disease, and cholesterol in the diet isn't the cause of heart disease, then how is it still that we think that cholesterol is the cause of heart disease, as all these things are supposed to be linked together? But of course, the cholesterol hypothesis during the 80s became much, much more powerful. And then statins launched in the late 80s, 1987, I think was the first launch. I might have got that wrong. And then really all of the money and all of the...
Ooh, we just lost him. Did we lose Dr. Kendrick? Well, as we work to get him back on, so Janet, kind of follow up with what he's saying about statins and cardiovascular disease.
Well, I'm hearing him loud and clear, because once we entered into pharmacy school, that was the narrative that we were taught, and I want to say that the pharmaceutical that came on board would have been Mevacor. Is that correct?
Yeah, lovastatin. It would have been the late 80s, yes.
And the whole research behind it that we were taught is that it was the consumption of fat. So we were supposed to train our patients to eat a low-fat diet, high-carb, and small protein diet. So basically, we went on all carbs. And not that I am opposed to carbohydrates, it's just that the ratio of it just changed dramatically. And that was supposed to solve the cardiovascular problem caused by cholesterol.
And literally, we were recommended, if you look at the food pyramid back in the 80s, we were recommended to eat 80% carbohydrates. And here's what I have to say about cholesterol and heart attacks. So the statins have been out for over 30 years, right, since the 80s. And cardiovascular disease is now the number one killer of Americans.
Right.
So, and yet almost probably 50% of the population seems to be on statins. So if statins are working, then how come cardiovascular disease is still killing everybody? So I don't think it's about cholesterol. I don't think statins are helpful. We have a comment from James Donovan, and there's Dr. Kendrick back. Go ahead and show our comment first, and go ahead and let one of my favorite doctors, awesome. So he's trying to get back in. It looks like we'll work on him. Thank you, James, for the comment. Yeah, great guy. As you know, James, saturated fat is not the enemy when it comes to heart attacks, cardiovascular disease, and cholesterol definitely isn't either. We all, if you look at the history of what we ate as hunters and gatherers, we ate mostly animal fat, animal meat, so protein and fat from animals, and we didn't die of heart attacks. So another comment we can answer while we're working on getting Dr. Kendrick in. Lifestyle observation with 25 grams of carbs every 4 hours, not to exceed 100 grams of carbs a day. From Amy. So great comment, Amy. To me, that honestly sounds like a lot of carbs if you're not an athlete or you're not working out a lot. And especially if you're eating 25 grams every 4 hours. I don't think we really need to fuel our bodies that much unless we're really, really active. If you've watched one of our podcasts about intermittent fasting, I think mostly when you look at the history of how we used to eat as hunters and gatherers, we were mostly fasting throughout most of the day, and we wouldn't eat big meals maybe once, maybe even 2 or 3 times a week. So when we had a big hunt. So eating 25 grams of carbs every 4 hours, I don't believe for most people would be a good idea, but you have to find out what diet works for you, and it's different for everybody. Janet, you have any comments on that?
Yes, I do. So I'm not in the hunter and gatherer view totally, because I do think that we we're able to store some of our food. I mean, my ancestors come from the Scandinavian country where, winter preserved a lot of food. So I think that kind of challenged it a little bit. But I do think that what we have forgotten is that our ancestors did survive on fat and proteins because carbs weren't always available. And if they did, they had to preserve them. So, and also our ancestors had to deal with, whatever work that they were dealing with. So, when I look at my ancestors, especially on the farming and ranching side of it, obviously their diet changed with their activity level. And as Americans, I don't know if we have embraced that. So, when my father was, during harvest, and obviously they were going to have a higher caloric need. So I think that people, lived in that realm, and that was part of life. It's part of, you ate according to activity levels and what you were doing.
So it looks like we're still trying to get Dr. Kendrick in. He can see us and hear us, I understand, but we can't see or hear him. So let's answer. There he is. Dr. Kendrick.
He's back.
There we are. Welcome back.
My computer went blue screen on me, which hasn't happened for many years, and then bang.
the dreaded blue screen of death.
It was. I thought I got rid of it ever since I got rid of whatever it is, Windows 87 or something. I think I have no idea what I'm on now, but I was just looking at it. I went bang, and then it was gone. So,
well, welcome back to the show.
It must be the cholesterol companies.
Yeah, right. You were just about talking about that when you're talking about the money and cholesterol and.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how much you heard of what Janet and I talked about, but
I heard a little bit, and then I you couldn't hear me, so I had to come back out and then again. Yep. So, technology is wonderful when it works.
It is.
Do you want me to just carry on, or
carry on, please? Okay,
sorry, yeah. So obviously, I was talking about where my ideas in cholesterol had come from, and in about 1990 or something, I was very much of the cholesterol. As we know, there's no such thing as cholesterol in your bloodstream anyway, and so the terminology is completely confusing. But I thought I was probably the only person in the entire world who thought this. It's like there's me, and there's all the other doctors, and everybody else thinks that cholesterol causes heart disease and statins should be prescribed to everybody. And I was a kind of little lonely person sitting in the wilderness beside my little campfire thinking, is there no one else in here? And then I did actually meet up online with, there's a group that started off called the International Network of Cholesterol Skeptics, THINKS, which was actually started by a Swedish doctor, Dr. Uffe Ravdskov, who is a fantastic, brilliant guy. And he wrote a book called The Cholesterol Myths, which was burnt, by the way, live on the television studio in Denmark, I think it was, just to give you some idea of how rational the thinking is in this area. And I did find that there were other people who were around who were thinking the same things. And in about 2007 or something, I'd written a few papers about it all. And in 2007, I wrote a book called The Great Cholesterol Con, which is basically saying it's all nonsense. And here's the data, and here's the information, and here's the facts. And I followed that up with another book called Doctoring Data, which is essentially how the pharmaceutical industry distorts all data. I wrote another book called Statin Nation, which is a follow-up that I said I would write. And then I thought, well, I've spent enough time telling people what doesn't cause heart disease. And I had spent decades trying to work out what does cause heart disease. And then I realized that I was looking at things completely the wrong way. Interestingly, yesterday, a doctor from Dundee, a consultant anaesthetist, wrote to me. He's just retired. And he said, when he was being taught about cardiovascular disease when he started medical school, which was in the late 1970s, that he was taught by a professor who said it's all caused by blood clotting. There's a damage to the endothelium, followed by blood clots, followed by fibrin, followed by the development of atherosclerotic plaques. So this was the dean of medicine in a Scottish university teaching what is essentially exactly the same thing as I talk about in the book. And when you go back and you look at it, you realize that over the years, there's been lots of people who have said, the cholesterol hypothesis is not correct. This is what causes heart disease. It's got nothing to do with cholesterol. I mean, the idea itself, I've come to realize it was first proposed in 1852 by Dr. Rudolf Virchow, who most people have never heard of. Karl von Rokitansky. Rudolf Virchow was the opposite guy. Karl von Rokitansky, he said that when he looked at atherosclerotic plaques, and yes, people were looking at atherosclerotic plaques in 1852 in Austria, he said these look like blood clots to me. They look like blood clots in various stages of repair and alteration, metamorphosis in the word he used. He called it the encrustation hypothesis. And so, yes, this is not a new idea. So I can't claim it's my idea. I'd like to, but I can't. And so it's 170 years old, this idea. So it precedes the cholesterol hypothesis by 100 years almost. Well, not quite. I like to say that to people. So you're going to say, well, if it's not cholesterol, because the cholesterol hypothesis is very simple to understand. It's that cholesterol, you eat saturated fat or cholesterol, the level in your blood rises. Well, we now know that none of that is actually true. And even if it is true, saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet have nothing to do with cardiovascular disease. Even the American Heart Association now accepts that. And they were the biggest promoters of the diet part of the hypothesis for 50 years, 60 years. So if it isn't that, what can cause a thickening and a fatty, as people have said, fatty lumps to build up in arteries? If it's not fat and it's not cholesterol, what can it be? And I think this was where Rokitansky struggled to answer the question from Rudolf Virchow, which is, well, actually, these fatty lumps and plaques that you see in arteries are underneath the lining of the artery itself. And you can't get blood clots underneath the lining of the artery itself because blood clots form within the blood. And this is outside of the bloodstream, if you like. And I think that knocked the theory on the head because he couldn't explain that. And I think he kind of, Virchow sort of went, gotcha. Although Virchow, who's some people say was the father of the cholesterol hypothesis, never believed that cholesterol had anything to do with causing it. So slightly ironic, of course. So moving away from cholesterol altogether and saying, well, what is it that we're looking at with heart disease? We are looking at, and I agree, most of what I'm going to say is in full agreement with what most researchers and medics say, which is, do you start off with a small plaque, maybe something so small you can't even see it in the blood vessel, and over the years this grows and grows and grows, and eventually, if you like that, the blood vessel is 90% blocked, and eventually a blood clot forms at that point, fully blocks the artery, and then you have a heart attack or a stroke or blood clots happening elsewhere in the body. So the actual process is sort of the same. It's just what causes all this to happen is very different. And the medical profession accept that a heart attack and a stroke is primarily due to blood clotting. They also accept that blood clots that form in arteries that don't fully block the artery become incorporated into the artery wall and make plaques grow. So they accept that plaques grow through thrombus or blood clots forming on areas. What they won't accept is that it starts that way as well. So if you like, it's a three-step process. The plaque starts, it grows bigger, it eventually blocks. The medical profession agrees, sections 2 and 3 just won't accept that the first part is got anything to do with blood clotting. It's all to do with cholesterol. But, you can't explain how that can happen. So essentially what you say is can you explain all of the processes you see by looking at a different process, which is the first step, the first thing that happens with atherosclerotic plaques, which are the underlying thing that causes heart disease, is that a small blood clot forms on the artery wall. That's fine. And that's, you can see that happens in places. Now, why would that happen? Well, that happens because the artery wall is lined with a thing called endothelium. And the endothelium is a single layer of cells that goes around, lines all blood vessels, not just arteries, veins and capillaries and even the smallest blood vessels as well. So And the endothelium is also lined by another thing called the glycocalyx, which if you speak to 100 doctors, I'm going to guarantee one might have heard of the glycocalyx. Probably the most important single physiological aspect to cardiovascular disease that there is. And the glycocalyx is, if you try and pick up a fish, most fish, try and pick up a shark, it doesn't happen. But if you pick up a normal fish and you try and grab hold of it, it slips out of your fingers. It's incredibly slippery. Why is it incredibly slippery? Because fish scales are covered in glycocalyx, which is basically glucose and protein in a kind of strands, like a little lawn. So all of your blood vessels have a small lawn inside them. And this lawn protects the endothelial cells. It allows things like red blood cells to just move very smoothly through. So when you get to a capillary, which is, say, that size, and then a red blood cell is almost exactly the same size, they have to squeeze through the capillary. And one of the ways that this happens is because the glycocalyx allows this to go through. And without the glycocalyx, if the glycocalyx is damaged, then capillaries can become damaged. Very small blood vessels can become damaged. And although it's called a different thing, it's called peripheral vascular disease, the very small blood vessel damage, you can see in, say, diabetes. You look at the back of people's eyes, and you can see damage to the capillaries, which shows up as burst capillaries, capillaries that have widened and formed aneurysms, etc., or they're just gone. So this peripheral artery disease is caused by damage to capillaries because the glycocalyx has been damaged. So if you want to look at what causes heart disease initially, you're going to ask yourself a question: what can damage the glycocalyx?
Yeah.
What damages it? And there's a whole series of things that can damage it. And obviously, smoking damages the glycocalyx. And smoking damages endothelial cells. So, if you look at the cholesterol hypothesis and say, well, how does it fit with smoking? Does smoking raise your cholesterol level? No. Does smoking do any of these things? No, it does. So smoking clearly causes heart disease, but how does it do it? And the answer is, if you smoke one cigarette, and they've shown this, and healthy volunteers have been asked to smoke one cigarette, and then they have measured damage to the endothelium. You can measure damage to the endothelium because a dead endothelial cell releases what they call microparticles. And these microparticles basically say to you, endothelial cells have died somewhere in the cardiovascular system. If you smoke one cigarette, one healthy volunteer as a non-smoker, you can see a quick rise in endothelial cell death and microparticles in the bloodstream. And that's because smoke from a cigarette is so small it can travel out of your lungs and into your bloodstream. It's called nanoparticles. Nanoparticles enter your bloodstream and bump up against the endothelium and start killing off endothelial cells. Now, normally what happens is this is repaired quite quickly, very quickly, by cells called endothelial progenitor cells. Floating in your bloodstream are the cells that become new endothelial cells. And if you smoke a cigarette, not only do the microparticles go up, these endothelial progenitor cells go up in number. So the bone marrow starts to produce the repair system very rapidly to cover over the areas of damage. So you can get away with smoking for quite some time because, yes, you're damaging the arteries, you're damaging the endothelium, but the body starts replacing it and covering it over. So you're getting tiny little areas of endothelial damage. Obviously, the more you smoke, and if you smoke and you do other things that damage the endothelium, then you're going to have a double whammy on your hands. So other things that can damage the glycocalyx, and one of the worst for this is a raised blood sugar level. There's for whatever reason is that high glucose levels in your blood strip the glycocalyx down, and you can actually see this happening. There's a device you can put under your tongue, which has fairly recently been invented, which looks at the thickness of your glycocalyx in the blood vessels in your tongue. This is one place where they are actually exposed to view quite easily. And you can see that if people's blood sugar levels go up, the glycocalyx thins quite quickly and then repairs itself. Because this is a very quickly repairing substance. The entire glycocalyx can be stripped off and repaired in 1 second, less than 1 second. So it's a very dynamic process that's going on. So you can say, well, how does diabetes cause heart disease? How does smoking cause heart disease? Well, you look at the glycocalyx in the endothelium, And you can see that they are both damaging exactly the same thing. And so they're both doing exactly the same thing, although they appear hugely different. Cigarette smoking and diabetes. How do you link them? That was interesting. When I was actually writing the book, I was writing a section on autoimmune diseases, which also increase the risk of heart disease. And you say, well, how does an autoimmune disease do this? Well, autoimmune disease is quite often is the body attacking itself. And one bit of the body that is often attacked is the vascular system. So you have a thing called a vasculitis. So systemic lupus erythematosus, which many people have heard of, but no one knows what it actually is, usually not even doctors, is that in systemic lupus erythematosus, young women who have this condition have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease of 5,000%.
Wow.
Now, that's a proper increase in risk. You say, well, how does it happen? Well, about 50% of people who have SLE, or it's more women than men, also have a thing called antiphospholipid syndrome alongside it, APS. Now, again, most people have never heard of APS, but APS, the phospholipids are what your cell membranes are made of, primarily. Two phospholipids back to back forms a cell membrane. So you can imagine if the body decides it doesn't like phospholipids very much and starts attacking them, then endothelial cells are going to get a pretty good hammering pretty quickly, and they do. You can get antiphospholipid syndrome separate to systemic lupus erythematosus. It's a condition, it's called Hughes disease. And these people die quite young of heart disease, heart attack, strokes, blood clots forming all over the body. Now, when I was writing this, I was also writing about viruses, because the influenza virus can attack the endothelium. Well, it attacks the it gets into the endothelial cells. Then the body says, I don't like this virus in these endothelial cells, so it starts attacking them. So once the body starts to attack its own endothelial cells, then you get blood clots forming, because you're stripping off the endothelium here, there, and everywhere. And while I was writing this, COVID came along. And people were saying, oh, we've got this condition where you get a sort of widespread immune reaction causing a thing like causing blood clots around the system. How can this possibly happen? I said, well, what happens is the COVID gets into your lungs. The virus then gets into your bloodstream. It then goes straight into your, because it goes, the COVID virus needs a thing called an ACE2 inhibitor to enter cells. And ACE2 inhibitors are found in endothelial cells and lung tissue primarily. So this is where the damage occurs with COVID. COVID gets into the lung tissue cells. The body starts looking at it, says, I don't like these viruses in these cells, and I'm going to attack it, and I'm going to kill it. And this is what they call the cytokine storm in COVID, where suddenly the immune system says, right, let's get rid of these viruses replicating in these cells. The cytokine storm causes an enormous sort of reaction and an inflammation. The lungs become full of rubbish, and then you can die of that. So if you can damp down the cytokine storm, you can reduce death rate from COVID in that stage. But of course, the COVID virus then has got into your cardiovascular system, where it is going into endothelial cells around your body and in your heart, your myocardium, your epicardium, your pericardium, your kidneys. Your kidneys have got quite a lot of ACE2 receptors as well. So what happens is that the virus gets into these cells. The body starts to rev up. It sees cells that are infected, because cells that are infected with the virus send out a message saying, I am infected. They send out a thing called a cytokine that's saying, I'm infected, please come and kill me, because you want to get rid of the virus that's inside. So the immune system, once it's wound up, starts looking at the endothelial system and saying, right, let's get rid of the virus. And of course, at the same time, it strips the endothelial cells off and the blood clots form. And that is what is happening with COVID and blood clotting. And while I was writing this, people were going, how on earth can a respiratory virus cause blood clots and heart disease and strokes? I'm like, well, it's the same reason as smoking causes it. It's the same reason as it's the same thing happening here. So what you want to do is obviously stop the body from having a real attack on the endothelial cells. Otherwise, you're going to get blood clots all over the place. That takes us into very dangerous territory of, well, do you want to be sticking spike proteins into people that get taken up by endothelial cells? anyway, I think you can see that could have been a concern there, which I did write about at the time. So essentially, what's happening is the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels are being damaged. And this happens mostly in the areas where the blood pressure and what you call the biochemical stress is highest. Because another question that can never be answered by the cholesterol hypothesis is, why does atherosclerosis and atherosclerotic plaques, why do they never develop in veins? Because the cholesterol level is exactly the same, the endothelium is exactly the same. So why isn't it being absorbed into vein walls? Why is it only artery walls? Now, there is no answer to that question. The only answer to that question is that clearly that's not what's happening. What is happening is that where you have blood vessels that are under the greatest, or the highest blood pressure, if you like, it's not just blood pressure. So you say, why does it mostly happen in the arteries in the heart? Why is that the commonest place for atherosclerotic plaques to develop? Why there? Well, the answer is that the pressure, obviously the heart contracts every second approximately. And as it contracts, it squeezes flat the coronary arteries, which is the name of the arteries in the heart, such that blood flows in the heart only at the point where the heart relaxes. So the opposite way around from the rest of the body. Because at that point, the arteries open the heart open up, the blood can flow, then the heart contracts, then they're slammed shut. So actually, blood flow in the heart is the anti-blood flow. But you can imagine someone described the coronary artery is a bit like someone, when it contracts, it's a bit like someone stamping on a garden hose every second. So these arteries are under terrific, what you call biomechanical stress all the time, all day, every day. And therefore, the endothelium within them is also getting slammed and bashed all the time. So it's not, if something is damaging to the endothelium, then within the heart, it's going to be doubly damaging. And the other place where you can really get, most often get plaques is in the arteries in the neck, the carotid arteries. Well, of course, the blood comes straight out of the heart, hits the aortic arch, goes through 180 degrees and then heads down the rest of your body. So at this point, you've got terrific turbulence and enormously high pressure going up into your neck. So when you look at it, where do plaques happen? Well, they happen in areas of greatest stress, if you like. And that would make sense because that's the area where the endothelium's under the greatest pressure and stress. And in the book, I sort of liken arteries to sort of whitewater rapids, where the water is tumbling down and rocks are getting turned over by the force of it. Whereas the veins, you're looking at sort of the delta valleys, where it's moving slowly and sluggishly, and there's not a lot of stress going on here. I mean, the blood pressure in the veins is around about 6 millimeters of mercury on average. The blood pressure in the arteries is about 120 millimeters of mercury. They just measure it in this terrifically arcane way. So you've got to say it's clearly got something to do with that, because if you take a vein from the leg, which has no atherosclerosis in it, and then put it into the heart and use it as a coronary artery bypass graft, within about 7 to 10 years, it will have severe atherosclerosis in it. So what has changed in this blood vessel? Well, everything is the same. The cholesterol level is the same. The level of everything is the same, except you put it into a different part of the body, which is at a higher blood pressure under higher stress. And in that situation, that is when atherosclerosis develops. So we have the answers. They're like staring you in the face. There are conditions where you have a hole in the heart, particularly in the ventricles, and so the blood pressure that is coming out the left-hand side of the heart that's supposed to go up the aorta goes back into the lungs at high blood pressure. This is called Eisenmenger's syndrome, but you don't need to know that. And people who have Eisenmenger's syndrome also have a very high rate of atherosclerotic plaque formation in their lungs. And you do not get atherosclerotic plaques in your lungs unless you have raised blood pressure in your lungs. So it's like, guys, this is like, it's staring you in the face. That it is to do with biomechanical damage to the endothelium. Once you've damaged the endothelium, there's a terrifically powerful message sent that the artery is damaged and you must form a blood clot here, right now, on this point. And that's what happens. Because the moment you strip endothelium off, you reveal an enzyme called tissue factor. And tissue factor sits there, and it's like the red, it's just a sudden alarm. It says blood clot here now. Because the body thinks the artery's been damaged. And if you damage an artery, you can bleed to death in whatever, a very short amount of time. So damage to arteries cannot be allowed to happen. Blood pressure, blood clot, bang, blood clot forms. If it's not big enough to block the artery, and mostly it isn't, the blood clot has to stop very quickly. But then you have a blood clot stuck to your artery, and it can't be allowed to break off and go down and through the rest of your body, because it'll just get stuck somewhere else, causing damage downstream. So you can't have the same situation as, if you scratch your hand, you get a blood clot forms, and then you get a scab, and the scab falls off. Well, inside an artery, if the scab forms and the scab falls off, it's going to cause mayhem. So it can't fall off. So the only thing the body can do with it is to cover it over with a new layer of endothelium, and then basically it's incorporated into the artery wall itself. Now, of course, most of the time after this has happened, the body comes along and clears it away. But if you get a repeated episodes of blood clot formation at the same point, the plaque will gradually grow. And again, you can read papers in journals like Atherosclerosis, where they've looked at people who've got atherosclerotic plaques in their arteries, and then they've done angiograms on them over yearly for however long. And what they've found is that those plaques do not gradually increase in size. They don't just gradually get bigger and bigger as cholesterol molecules all sort of fill into that area. No, what happens is they suddenly grow. Bang. They grow all of a sudden. And then they stop. And then they might grow all of a sudden again. So what's the only possibility that could be happening is that another blood clot formed at that point. It was covered over. It was covered over with endothelium, but it then grew because there was more clot left stuck in the same area. And there's plenty of journals, there's hundreds of journals that agree that this is what is happening, and yet they still will not agree that atherosclerosis is to do with blood clots forming one on top of another. And if you look at a lot of plaques, and you slice them open, they've got layers, layer after layer after layer after layer after layer, like tree rings. They don't all look like this, but about 40% do. And the explanation, and if you read the explanation, it's, well, obviously what's happened here is we've had repeated blood clots have happened at the same point and have gradually grown over years, but not gradually. It's happened bang, gap, bang, gap, bang. And this is all widely accepted. Obviously, I can't quote references. I'm not going to show you references here, but you can look this stuff up. So none of this is remotely controversial. And yet, still, we have this stuck to, well, it's cholesterol that starts it off. So, well, how does it do that? They can't explain it. They can't explain it because it doesn't. Because there is no way. We don't have cholesterol in our bloodstream. We have lipoproteins, and the one that we're blamed for everything is LDL. And they say, well, the LDL molecules must somehow or other leak through past the endothelium, well, at one point and nowhere else. So how does that happen? Oh, well, it just does. Well, how does that happen? Well, it does. No, it doesn't happen because it can't happen. And even if it could happen, it doesn't make any sense. Because veins, the other thing that, unfortunately, you speak to doctors about this, that sadly, they know nothing. All big blood vessels are supplied by their own blood vessels, which sounds extraordinary, but it's true. They're called vasa vasorum, the blood vessels of the blood vessels. So around your aorta, around your big arteries, around your big veins, there's a network of small blood vessels that move through the artery wall and supply it with all the nutrients it needs. And without these nutrients being supplied by the vasa vasorum, they would die because they're too thick to get oxygen and other nutrients through. And anyway, the endothelium blocks them coming through because that's its job. So actually, it's and you can see that essentially this happens is that all the nutrients and all the LDL and everything that the blood vessel needs come in from behind the artery, if you like, the opposite way around. And you can get as much LDL in that way as you want, because it flows quite freely out of these vasa vasorum and into the artery wall. So why doesn't this LDL that can freely flow build up into plaques? Whereas the LDL that can't get through the endothelium is the stuff that's supposed to cause the plaque. None of this makes any sense. If you start looking at it, it's like, nope, that is rubbish. That doesn't make any sense. They don't even bother to explain these things at all. And so equally, veins have more vasa vasorum than arteries. And if you do a coronary artery bypass, you try and preserve the vasa vasorum in the vein, because if you don't have vasa vasorum, or you strip them off or you damage them, that bypass is more likely to get atherosclerosis than if it doesn't have the vasa vasorum. And the vasa vasorum is a thing that, I mean, everywhere you look at this, I mean, I realize that people thinking about vasa vasorum, glycocalyx, I'm getting all this new information. Well, this shouldn't be new information. This is just, one of the problems that Rokitansky had in 1852 was that he didn't know there were things called endothelial progenitor cells, so he couldn't explain how a new layer of endothelium could grow. He didn't know there was such a thing as glycocalyx. When the cholesterol hypothesis first came along, people didn't even know there were different lipoproteins. They didn't know there was LDL and HDL and VLDL and all these other LDLs. Yeah. So we have a hypothesis that we created when people knew almost nothing about the cardiovascular system. And with each new thing you learn, you realize, well, that makes the cholesterol hypothesis complete nonsense. And yet we still cling to it. And yet we had the hypothesis that worked in 1852. In 1947, there was a chap called Duguid, J.C. Duguid, he was actually Scottish, but he proposed an update of the incrustation hypothesis. I was taught by a cardiologist in Aberdeen University who said that LDL cannot penetrate the endothelium, and that the cause of atherosclerosis is blood clots transforming into plaques. I wasn't taught it quite as clearly as that, but that's what I was being taught. So it's not like this is some completely out of the blue, never been thought of thing ever before thing. It's like people have been thinking about this for 170 years. It makes sense. It works. It explains how smoking can cause heart disease. Diabetes can cause heart disease. It explains how Kawasaki's disease can cause heart disease. It explains how sickle cell disease. It explains how autoimmune diseases can cause heart disease. It explains how cocaine can cause heart disease. It explains how viruses can cause heart disease. It explains how periodontitis can cause heart disease. Here's another one that everyone sort of knows is true. If you've got infection in your gums, gingivitis and tooth infections, you're more likely to have heart disease. And so how can that possibly happen? Well, here's how it happens. It's because bacteria produce things called exotoxins. Exotoxins just means a toxin outside of itself. These exotoxins float around the bloodstream and attack the endothelium and attack the glycocalyx and cause blood clotting and cause heart disease. And we know this is the case because sepsis is the most extreme version. Sepsis is the most extreme version of a bacterial infection in your bloodstream. Because what happens is the bacteria get into your bloodstream and they start to multiply. And as they do so, they produce toxins, exotoxins. These exotoxins strip your endothelium and your glycocalyx. They cause blood clots throughout your body. And when you've seen people who've had sepsis or meningococcal sepsis, they can lose their fingers and they can lose their arms and they can lose their noses and their ears and the peripheral. And people say, how does that happen? Well, because blood clots are forming all over the body, and they're forming in the small blood vessels supplying your fingers. So your fingers die. It's exactly the same thing happening here as it is with COVID on a different level. In this case, the COVID is inside the blood vessel, inside the endothelium, and the body decides to attack the endothelium. With sepsis, the toxin decides to attack the endothelium and the glycocalyx. And of course, it's a much more acute thing. And in sepsis, if you use a device to measure the thickness of the glycocalyx during sepsis, the strongest predictor of survival in sepsis is keeping a glycocalyx thickness of a certain amount. And if your glycocalyx thins down to zip virtually, you're going to die of sepsis because your cardiovascular system is being obliterated. So the reason why I wrote the book really was to say, well, can you bring it all together? Can you make some sense of what we're seeing? Can you explain why, for instance, lead causes heart disease when it has nothing to do with the cholesterol hypothesis? Can you explain how smoking causes heart disease? Can you explain how diabetes causes heart disease? Can you explain how viral infections can cause heart disease? And can you explain them through the same process? And the answer is yes, you can. And people have explained it through these processes for years, decades, centuries.
You just did. And I got to tell you, one of the greatest things about our podcast is that I learned something from specialists like you. So, I mean, that was very educational for me. I was always very skeptical about cholesterol and heart disease, and especially as I just, learned more and more, and just look at the numbers. But now I have an explanation about why, and some analogies like smoking, and how can smoking and diabetes, which have really nothing to do with cholesterol, cause heart disease, which we know that there's an increased risk of heart disease. That's a great, a great analogy that we can use. It's pretty simple to explain, and then yet there's no cholesterol link with diabetes and smoking. So, right. So I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Kendrick. You definitely educated me. One of our goals of this podcast, the biggest goal of this podcast, is to educate and empower individuals to take charge of their own health. And I think you're realizing that goal. Do you mind us answering some questions? We got some comments from some viewers.
Yeah, no problem, if I can.
Yeah. So let's go back to Amy. Steph, can you read that, Dr. Kendrick?
Every patient has an MCG heart scan. I'm not sure what that is exactly. I presume it's like a calcium heart scan. I'm not sure. Is referred to start taking arterisol from Calroy Health. I don't know what that is either.
You know what? It sounds like Amy has some products she's trying to promote. So let's go on to Jeannie Moore. She's been on our podcast before. What does this one say?
Doc Shen. I don't know who that is.
I don't either. But Jeannie, thank you. And then James had another comment. Okay, what does Dr. Kendrick think about the hypothesis that linoleic acid from seed oils may cause oxidized LDL?
Well, I'm not a great fan of any type of polyunsaturated fats in that. Well, I'm not hugely against them, but this oxidation of LDL is another one. Is a kind of desperate attempt to support the LDL hypothesis.
Right.
Is that if LDL is oxidized, then it damages the endothelium, and then this is an answer as to was really LDL all the time. Oxidation is. I've spoken to chemists about oxidation. They just laugh at this concept. But essentially, endothelial cells actually have specific LOX LDL receptors to take out oxidized LDL. They quite like it, actually, and they use it for their cholesterol needs. And the liver can get rid of oxidized or damaged LDLs like that. I sometimes ask the question, you've heard of homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, or you may not have, which is both parent, you get both, what's the word I'm looking for? Both genes for familial hypercholesterolemia. So you have homozygous rather than heterozygous. Affects about 1 in 250,000 people, where the LDL level can be about, in American terms, in UK terms, it would be about 30 millimoles, which is about 20 milligrams per deciliter, 25 milligrams. Anyway, vastly high.
So low, basically.
No, hugely high. No, it wouldn't be. It'd be 500 or 600. Sorry, I'm going.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay.
I'm doing my conversion the wrong route. Anyway,
yeah.
ridiculously high. And they die quite young, but I mean, let's face it. But if you do a liver transplant in a child with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, who have LDLs that are maybe 20 times normal, the familial hypercholesterolemia in their case disappears instantaneously. It's gone, all right? And the reason for that is that they now have functioning LDL receptors in their liver, and the liver just pulls it straight out of the bloodstream and gets rid of it. So the oxidized LDL argument is just a desperate attempt to support the LDL argument, in my opinion. And when you have all the oxidization means is that the LDL has been hanging around in the bloodstream for longer than it would normally do. And therefore it becomes oxidized, which is a sign of other things happening in your metabolism. So you've got to watch out for that. So it's not a bad sign that something is going wrong, but it is not a cause of anything, oxidized LDL. It's in the same terms as having a high VLDL or triglyceride level and a low HDL level. All that means is you've got insulin resistance and the body is struggling to deal with lipids in the liver. And it's a bad sign, but it's not a cause of anything. And there's some recent papers have come out showing that very high HDL levels are actually causal for heart disease. And they've had a new drug that came out, I've just forgot the name of, to lower your triglyceride or VLDL levels, and it made no difference to the rate of heart disease whatsoever. So a lot of these things come along and you can say, look at this, it's oxidized. And you go, yeah, it's not causing anything. It's just a sign that LDL has been hanging around for too long in your bloodstream. And that's a bad thing because it means your liver's not dealing with the fats properly. That makes sense.
So let's go back on that, a super high LDL. So you say those people die young when they have those LDLs in the 500s.
Yeah.
What do they die from? Not cardiovascular disease is what you're saying?
Slightly ironically, of course, that's what they do die of. Now, there's a guy called Stevens who was a New Zealand pathologist who looked at these children or young people who died and said, what is it they're actually dying of? Well, actually, when you have homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which means your levels are extraordinarily high. It's probably more than that. It's probably what's the normal level? Is 200 in the States, isn't it? So it would be 30 times. It'd be 30 times 200. It'd be 6,000, right?
Okay, because 100 milligrams per deciliter or less is considered a normal LDL.
A normal LDL. So it would be 30 times that. All right. So it'd be 3,000.
Okay. Wow.
So,
okay.
So we're talking about an incredible. What happens there is that the LDL starts to, and because I've talked to you about the vasa vasorum, what happens is the arteries actually begin to entirely thicken up. All of your arteries thicken up. Your blood actually becomes hyper clotty, very hypercoagulable when the LDL is that high. And all sorts of other things are going wrong as well. So they do tend to die of heart disease, but they die of a very different condition. It's a storage disease, as Stephen said. It's not the same thing. The plaques don't exist. What you have is basically super hyper thickened arteries and blood vessels and everything. So it's a very different condition. And as I often say to people, if you had any other substance in your blood that was sort of 20 times normal, you'd be dead in about 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, to suggest that these people have any relationship. The only other thing, I've written papers about as well, is that the LDL receptor itself has some very important processes it's associated with. It takes factor 8 out of the bloodstream, for example. It has a considerable impact on blood clotting itself. So it may well be with hypercholesterolemia of certain sorts, and in fact we have written a paper about it. Is that actually it's the blood clotting you're hyper blood clotty, if you like. You're hypercoagulable if you don't have LDL receptors, and when you have a lack of LDL receptors, your LDL level goes quite high. But that's probably not, or that, in my opinion, that isn't the thing that increases the risk of heart disease. It's the blood clotting that it also goes wrong at the same time. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. I can't go into that now because it gets hyper technical. But
speaking of hyper technical, so is there a way that where is the best resource? Do you have on any of your blogs? If we want to get into some of these more technical things, how do we find out more information on it?
Right. Well, I don't tend to get super technical on the blog. I mean, the paper we wrote, I'm trying to remember the title of it now, which is it's FH, hypercoagulation in FH, which I co-authored with David Diamond, myself, Ufi, and Michael DeLogero. I can flip that over to you because I'm struggling to remember the exact title now. You write the paper, I can't remember what it's called. But essentially, what we looked at there was, that there is there's a small proportion of people with familiar hypercholesterolemia, which people talk about all the time and say, aha, these people are more likely to get heart disease. There's a registry that's kept in the UK called the Simon Broome Registry. And what they found is that a small proportion of people with familiar hypercholesterolemia at quite a young age are more likely to die from heart disease. And people have used this as and the rate is considered to be 500% increase in risk. To which we said, yes, but the actual number of people that they found was about 11 versus 2 out of 10,000, which is how statistics are manipulated.
Yeah, absolute risk versus relative risk.
Absolute risk versus relative.
Drug companies do it all. Yeah.
Well, what they don't go on to say is, yes, but once you reach the age of 50, if you've got familiar hypercholesterolemia, is that you are less likely to die of heart disease. So it's a bit like saying to people, if you smoke before the age of 50, you're more likely to get lung cancer. But if you smoke after the age of 50, you're less likely to get lung cancer. But we still tell you that smoking causes lung cancer. It's like, right. Well, you can think that if you like, but I'm afraid you're going to get no points in my logic course. That one. You're just going to get, don't say stupid things. And also, of course, as I've also said about familial hypercholesterolemia, it's a terrible disease. It gives you no symptoms whatsoever. And if you've got it, you live exactly the same length of time as somebody who hasn't got it. So that's a really serious disease to suffer from. It causes no problems whatsoever, and you live just as long as everybody else. So in what way is that a disease, precisely?
Well, if we name it a disease, then we can treat it with a drug. Right? I mean, I'm being facetious, but we're on the same page. I mean, that's really what it is when you look at, statins, and pretty much anybody over 60 years old, most traditional doctors will put somebody on a statin, even if they don't have high cholesterol, because they think it's going to prevent cardiovascular disease. It's just an outright lie. And now if you've got diabetes, which like everybody seems to have it now, I was just looking at a paper. I was actually asked to peer review a paper from Taiwan where they looked at people with cholesterol who had diabetes and what their cholesterol levels were and what the rate of death was at different cholesterol levels. And the highest rate of death in people with diabetes was at the lowest cholesterol level, lowest LDL, they actually measured level. And this paper is covering about 60,000 people over 15 years. It's the first time anyone's ever looked at it. What did they find? The lower your cholesterol level is, the more likely you are to die. So and now what's the advice? To get your cholesterol level as low as possible if you've got diabetes. Yeah, right.
I mean, come on, guys. How long can this be maintained? I don't know. Forever.
Right. I mean, it's as healthcare professionals, we have to start educating people about the realities and absolute risk versus a relative risk when it comes to studies, and that they can control their lifestyle and their outcomes. Yeah. There's no magic drug that you're going to take to prevent cardiovascular disease or to prevent diabetes. No. Diabetes is not a drug deficiency. No. Type 2 diabetes is not a drug deficiency. It's a diet-related issue. It's a carbohydrate metabolism problem, and you need to change your diet.
Yes.
There is no drug that's going to fix your diabetes, period. Now, if you go down the traditional road, you'll be on drugs and listen to the traditional doctors, you'll be on drugs the rest of your life. Will you live longer? No. You'll probably die earlier.
Yes. And you'll get fatter and fatter with most of them. Although the newer ones, yes, the really expensive ones actually seem to have some impact on making people lose a bit of weight. But yes, I mean, the advice for many years has been, chase your sugar with your insulin. It's like,
Right, and giving insulin to a type 2 diabetic is like putting gasoline on a house fire. Literally, they have enough insulin. It's just not working. I mean, it's crazy.
It's not crazy if you want. I mean, I was looking at the pharmaceutical companies and their which markets they think are going to grow the most over the next 10 years, and diabetes is number one. Well, I think it was 12% expansion per year for the next 10 years. It's going to be worth 180 billion a year in 10 years' time, or whatever it was. I just looked at it and thought, this they see as a cause for celebration. I'm like,
I know. And just think, we can change that by just changing our diet and our lifestyle.
Yes.
But they don't want that.
Of course they don't want that. You know, I'm very friendly with David Unwin over here. You've probably heard of him. You know, he did a study on his patient, about 200 patients in his practice, where he got them to eat a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, and I think 60% of them reversed their diabetes. The drug costs went down by 100,000 per year in his practice alone. The weight loss was something like 20 metric tons between 20 of them. I mean, it's, you know, and still we get,
well,
you know.
I know, and it's just, you know, it's because of the traditional system and traditional doctors just not wanting to believe that things can be reversed with diet. And no. I constantly am debating with doctors all the time about it, and pharmacists, and I get some haters out there on social media that tell me how crazy I am and say that type 2 diabetes is not reversible. And this is the challenge that I give them. If you want to see if type 2 diabetes is not reversible, and if you're on medications that can severely lower your glucose like insulin, don't do this. But very carefully, go on a fast for 48 hours.
Yeah.
Any type 2 diabetic, I challenge them to go on a fast for 48 hours. I guarantee you, without being on medications, your blood glucose will normalize.
Yeah.
I guarantee you, right?
Well, of course it will. It must do. Yeah. Physiology says it will.
Exactly. I mean, right. It's just logical, but yet we don't do that. We tell them to eat every 4 hours. We tell them to eat an 80% carbohydrate diet. We tell them to turn their insulin up or take more drugs. It's like, no, it's a diet problem.
Yes. Well, well, diabetes. I mean, I think my interest in diabetes came in part from my interest in cholesterol, because obviously there's the reason why people are told to eat this high carbohydrate diet is because when the diet hypothesis gained foothold, it was, well, saturated fat causes heart disease, and diabetics in about the mid-late 70s were found to have much higher rates of heart disease. They said, well, we must stop them eating fat and saturated fat. So that's when they changed it over to saying, well, they must start eating carbohydrates because that will stop them getting heart disease. And so the whole thing links together horribly. It's kind of like, you know, I've used the analogy of the geocentric model versus the heliocentric model, which is, you know, people said the Earth is at the center of the universe and everything rotates around it. And once you've decided that diet and saturated fat causes heart disease and it's cholesterol, then you create a galaxy of nonsense that all rotates around it. So of course, and if you get rid of that thing in the middle, then you have to say, well, all of this starts to fall to pieces. So they don't want all of it to fall to pieces, right? Because there's huge sums of money involved in all of this and reputations and blah, blah, blah. So you know, you're not going to get a rapid change, because if you pick this particular jumper, if you pick one of the strands from it, the whole thing just goes poof,
right,
and everything falls to bits, and then they're all left going, so it was all bullshit.
Right. And that's why some people are so strong about not moving the needle about it.
Yes.
You know, they just, and cardiologists especially are some of the worst. They don't, because they realize that if they stop believing that cholesterol causes heart attacks, then whatever they've done for the last 30 years is a problem.
Yes. Well, of course. I mean, I remember the first time I came across the sort of defensiveness was actually in breast surgery. I was a medical student, and the professor at the university was well renowned for being the radical mastectomy king. He removed the old breasts and everything he could find that could be removed in all directions, leaving women horribly mutilated and edema in their arms and everything. And I read an article, I think it was the BMJ, and it said that this doctor in Holland had tried less radical surgery, and the results were of survival and whatever were as good, and the damage and the mutilation was far less, and therefore it seemed to be a good idea. And I mentioned this paper to this professor in a kind of grand round, and basically he went completely apeshit and stripped me to shreds in front of about 30 other doctors and tried to humiliate and crush me. And I thought, oh well, I thought I won't be doing that again. But clearly, I mean, this is what he did. This was his job, and then I'm saying you shouldn't be doing it. And what you're saying to him is, you've been mutilating women for 30 years of your life unnecessarily. He's not going to immediately welcome you with open arms. So, it's not just a money thing here. There's a gigantic sort of, oh my God, how dare you even suggest that I have been doing stupid things and damaging people? Well, it's not going to go down well, is it? So these are not people that are ever going to change their minds. You have to start the changing of minds elsewhere, because other people may be more open. It's not so important to them, so they're more open to seeing the facts, if you like.
Right. Well, I always go back to the story back in the late 1800s, I believe, maybe mid 1800s, when a medical student dared to question that doctors were killing their patients because they weren't washing their hands.
Yeah.
And he got blackballed. And
that was
look at it.
I know. The famous Hungarian Semmelweis, 1840. Yes, because you're not going to... And this is a huge problem, is that the people that are in the positions of power and authority are the people who stand to lose the greatest amount if this stuff is proven to be bullshit. Well, it has been proven to be bullshit. But, and therefore, your average person on the street goes, well, this professor of this, and the American Society of that, and the European Society of this, and they all say the same thing. And you, who the hell are you? Who the hell are you? You're a GP. You're a family physician. What do you know about cardiology? Well, actually, she says, I sometimes think to myself, though I rarely say it, I've forgotten more about cardiology than you will ever know. Well, I do know quite a lot about it, actually. But, people don't appreciate it when you tell them that they're being stupid, I find. So you just have to laugh a bit and go,
that's right.
It's eminence-based medicine we're suffering from, isn't it? That I am eminent and you are not, and so therefore you're wrong.
And if there's anything the last 3 years have taught us, that's completely what it's been. Nobody's an expert. There's only a few experts at the top, and if you don't listen to them, then you're crazy.
Yes.
And you're a conspiracy theorist. If we can take anything away from the last 3 years, we can definitely take that away.
Yeah. Well, I would send you to look. There's an article that the man who, more than anyone, was responsible for bringing evidence-based medicine into the world was David Sackett from McMaster in Canada. He worked at Oxford. I met him a few times. A really, really nice, brilliant guy. So he wrote a couple of articles saying that basically he thinks that experts have far too much influence. They should all shut up and be retired every 3 years, because they have too much. People pay them too much attention. In fact, although he was an expert in evidence-based medicine, said, I'm not going to write, review, lecture, or talk about this subject ever again, because people pay far too much attention to what I have to say, and they don't question me, and they just fall into line. And I think this is terrible, and it's stopping things from developing. So ironically, the one expert who should never have retired himself.
Right.
There's a catch-22 here somewhere, isn't there? But the rest of them, they love being in their positions, and they pontificate and they stomp on people who disagree with them. And I can understand human nature to do this, but by God, what we need is for people to understand that expertise is a wonderful thing. Knowledge and expertise is a wonderful thing, but experts are very often the worst thing, especially when something new or different comes along, that you need you need to. These people should just be put in a box and said, "You're fine, yeah, okay." But that was 20, 30 years ago. We're now talking about now, all right? And now is not then. You're an expert because of stuff you learned about when you were starting off, and you spent 40 years becoming a world expert in it. Great, well done. But as Feynman said, science is a belief in the ignorance of experts, and yet we all seem to have lost sight of this somehow or other, haven't we?
So, Dr. Kendrick, I appreciate you being on today. As we wrap this podcast up, I'd like to ask you, what do you have a passion for? I think it's been relatively obvious, but go ahead and tell us what your passion is.
Well, what I really want to do is to, I'd like to see medical research, what's the word? I wouldn't like decorruptified, opened up, and I would like to see the systems. This is quite a big subject, all right? But I think medical research is close to broken, right? And that's a really scary thing, because what happened with COVID is a number of people began to think, we're being told this stuff and it's rubbish. I mean, I've known for years that a lot of stuff we're told is rubbish. I've been a fake news man for 30 years, but the opposite way around. So somehow or other, we have to regain trust. Well, a lot of people trust it, unfortunately. We have to almost demolish trust in the system as it is and put something else in its place that is a better system. I want to trust medical papers when I read them. I want to believe that when a medical expert speaks, it's not because they've got somebody's hand up their ass, controlling them from the pharmaceutical industry. I want organizations like the AHA, the ACC, NIH, CDC to be freed from or to be purged from commercial interests as much as is possible. We're entering a very scary time, I think, with medical research. And what I really want to do is to see how we can clean it up.
Awesome. So if anybody wants to reach out to you or has any questions, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, I've got a blog, drmalcolmkendrick.org. If you write a question on that, which is showing up here, if you write a question on there to me as an email, I'll get it. And if I decide it's a sort of reasonable question, I will respond. If I think it's a bit of a lunatic question, I'll probably not respond and decide that this conversation is not going to continue. So yes, that way people can also, if people comment on blogs that I do respond. I look at them all, and sometimes I've had like 2,000 comments I've had 2,000 comments on some of my blogs, which gets a bit time consuming at times. But so yes, I do like to have a debate with people. Love to discuss it, and that's that.
Awesome. I love it, Dr. Kendrick. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Sorry about our little technical glitch.
Hey, no worries. It worked out. I didn't know if we were going to get you back on, so I am so glad that you were able to get back on. And we'll have to thank Bill Gates for the blue screen of death, because that's been common since Windows has been developed.
That's the first time I've seen it for about a year or 2 years.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kendrick. Listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Tune in Monday, our regularly scheduled podcast, 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. We'll see you then. Thank you so much.